Nothing short of extraordinary.
An impossible love story during the Holocaust.
I managed to get pregnant, which is totally stupid.
A pregnant woman was not a situation that was survivable.
If you made a dozen movies out of this, nobody would believe them.
When I saw him, I thought he was the best-looking man I have ever seen in my life.
From the security of family life to a place of nightmares.
It looked like hell. We didn't know what was happening.
Anka's husband was taken away.
People were selected to die. I did not understand.
In all the confusion,
We were deadly desperate.
a horrible mistake was made.
My mother volunteered to follow him to Auschwitz.
The day they were married, then began what they dreaded most of all. His time had come. Anka's beloved Bernd was among 1,000 young men who were to be transported away from his wife and their happiness.
She met him in a nightclub where she was with a group of friends.
When I saw him, I thought, I don't see right, because he was the best-looking man I have ever seen in my life. And until today, I haven't changed my mind, I must say.
After a last bittersweet night together, Anka eventually waved her husband goodbye. Soon afterwards, his young wife received a similar notification to report for transportation.
I got a sort of postcard that I should come on that day with 50 kilos of luggage.
With her best handbag, hat, and a small suitcase, Anka carried a large hat box tied with string. In it were 3 dozen of her maid's delicious, sugar-coated donuts. Bernd's favorite treat.
And there was one young German soldier. He could see that she was having great difficulty carrying a box of the donuts. And he said to her, "Es ist scheißegal, ob die Schachtel mitkommt," which means, I couldn't give a shit if that box goes with you or not.
His words sent a shiver down Anka's spine as she sensed that it wouldn't matter either way.
She was a young woman, she was full of self-confidence, and she wasn't going to be bullied by anybody. If you are told you're forbidden to do something, well, your gut reaction is to go and do it. When my mother arrived in Terezin, the sexes were segregated.
She found out that Bernd was in the all-male Sudeten barracks not too far away. Later that night, she was reunited with Bernd, finally able to present him with donuts, which were by then stale and soggy. She said he still ate them happily. Nobody was allowed out of their barracks unless they had a signed permit or a police escort, but the couple still managed to find ways of meeting, by each discovering where the other would be working and making short, risky detours. They were able to spend a few clandestine moments together. Lying on a dirty mattress, itching from bites, the air around her unendurable, Anka could not help but recall the romantic candlelit nights she and Bernd used to enjoy in their Prague apartment.
I managed to get pregnant. That was the biggest sin we could have committed, because there were segregation of sexes. My mother stayed in the same barracks as I did. She looked at me, how and where? She laughed, actually, because in all that misery she had a sense of humor.
But to be Jewish and become pregnant under the Nazi regime was a serious crime.
Without knowing that his wife was pregnant, Bernd was then marched to the rail spur on the fringes of the camp and loaded onto a crowded passenger train.
My father was sent to Auschwitz. My mother actually volunteered to follow him the very next day. As they had survived 3 years up to that point, she thought, well, nothing could get any worse. Little did she know.
Climbing up into crowded third-class passenger carriages, as the doors were locked behind them and the blinds pulled down, Anka tried not to panic and hoped that the journey taking her to her husband would not be too long.
We saw the chimneys spouting the smoke and fire and the smell. And it looked like hell. We didn't know what was happening there. Our heads were shaved and they took all our clothes and we were naked there.
If they resisted, they would be shot. Anka had somehow managed to hold on to her plain wedding band and the engagement ring Bernd had given her, secreting it under her tongue or holding it in her fist.
And we slowly were sent into a barrack where there were already other people. It was cold and windy and horrible. And a friend of mine who was standing next to me asked one of the girls who were there, "When will I see my parents?" And they all started laughing like mad, "You stupid cow," or God knows what not. "They are in the chimney by now." In that moment, you knew what was happening there.
There was nothing to fill their bellies but stale, dry bread. There wasn't even a blade of grass to eat. Anka ached to be back in the arms of Bernd. Had Bernd, too, gone through this shocking phase of acclimatization when he'd arrived in Auschwitz a week earlier? Was he in a bunk somewhere on the other side of the camp, worrying about her the same way she was worrying about him?
During those 6 months, she was becoming progressively more and more starved and more pregnant, which was very, very dangerous for her. At the end of March, the beginning of April of 1945, my mother was put on yet another train with no food and hardly any water.
The train journey lasted 3 weeks. Anka was on the brink of starvation and by now was 9 months pregnant.
I was getting thinner and thinner, but my stomach was getting bigger and bigger.
Discovery of her condition would have meant her immediate return to the gas chambers. Finally, the train arrived at its destination. Mauthausen death camp. At this very moment, Anka went into labor.
When my mother saw the name, Mauthausen, at the station, the shock was so great that she thinks it provoked the onset of her labor. And she started to give birth to me on that coal truck.
We went up the hill and I was sort of starting to give birth to the child. And there they stopped just before the opening of the main doors of Mauthausen. And there I had to climb down from that wagon and nobody helped me.
I was sitting up and my baby started to come, she said. Anka screamed but then stopped herself because of the proximity of the SS.
And there was another Nazi officer who saw that she was in the midst of child labor, and he said to her, "Du kannst weiter schreien," which means you can carry on screaming. She was screaming not only because she was in labor, but because she thought this was her very last minute on this earth. She thought she was about to die.
Convulsed with pain and convinced those were to be her final minutes on Earth, she raged freely. Anka finally gave birth.
Despite all the odds, Anka's baby had made it into the world, but at the worst possible moment.
I had only one fear, that the baby wouldn't survive, she said. Within those walls, she feared there would be no possible escape.
Anka and her newborn baby were on their way to the gas chambers of Mauthausen. But then, a miracle.
On the 28th of April 1945, the Germans had run out of gas for the gas chamber. My birthday is the 29th. A few days after my birth, the American Army liberated the camp.
Anka was free at last. When she was strong enough, she and baby Eva returned home to Prague.
But instead of being reunited with Bernd, she was alone. No one returned. She learned soon after from an eyewitness that Bernd had been shot on a death march a week before liberation.
That was the worst moment of the whole war for me, to arrive in Prague, which I wished all through the time, when will I be home? And there was no home. Nothing.
Anka's parents, sisters, brother-in-law and nephew had all been killed. Other survivors returned home to discover they had lost everything and everyone.
I had no money, no clothes, and a little baby. She was the greatest help of all, without knowing it. This fantastic growing thing. It's unbelievable how much it gives you and how much you can take for somebody else.
My mother just held me all the time.
The mother's love and all that, it's the most potent thing in life, I find. You get over everything.
She asked somebody to give her some money to go on the tram. And she thought that if anybody had survived, there was a chance it would be her cousin.
I ring the bell and the door opens and the whole family waits for me there and say, "Where have you been? We heard you are coming to us." And they were just marvelous. Now I will start crying. My God.
My aunt had even heard that my mother had survived and that incredibly she had a baby. My mother asked, please could we stay for a few days to recover?
And the few days ran to 3.5 years, and it was just, I found a new family.
Against all odds, she survived her tragic past. For years, she was holding on to hope. Hope that she wouldn't get sick or lose her baby. Hope that she would make it out of there alive.
I perhaps am the only person, idiotic as I am, who thought that I would get through it and I will come home. Never doubted it. And seeing all these people going in the gas every day, being pregnant and the baby, I knew I was coming home, which is totally stupid. But I lived with this idea.
Even though she never saw him again, her love for Bernd lives on with Eva, their daughter.
He was the best looking man I have ever seen in my life. And until today, I haven't changed my mind, I must say.
Today, the woman who gave birth in a concentration camp has built her own family.
I have 2 sons, and they have 3, now 4 children between them. And my mother could never get over the fact that she had survived her wartime experiences, I survived, and that she ended her life with 3 great-grandchildren.
Anka has taught us that no matter what happens, we must never lose hope.